So Ephesians chapter 3, that's where we're going to be. We're going to be in this little section right here today. Now, this is one of those times where you study something and you're required to do it. This is coming up. I got to do it. And it was beyond, it's hard to even put into words, just beyond a blessing to study this text, because any of you who have read Ephesians over the years, you get to this part and it's a very quick read. It's just a nice, you got this nice benediction in there that everyone is very familiar with, and this nice little prayer, and that's about it. No one really spends any time thinking deeply about this section. And it was a joy this week to really just go through it and to have to really think through it. And brethren, ultimately, as we go through this text, this is not here by accident. This is the middle of Paul's letter, which means whatever he says right here and in 3 and in 4 is very important to the rest of this letter. And so we ought not to discount this part as it's a cute prayer. Paul likes to throw out, benedictions here and there. This is something that's very important to Paul. And so as we walk through this text today, I hope it's a blessing for you, it's a blessing for me. So let me start off. I want to ask you guys something, because I think this text here kind of begs this question from us. And it's something that you should think about as a Christian, especially not just as a Christian individually, which we all are, but we all know that we don't function individually as Christians. We function within a body. We function within a church together. So a question that you need to be able to answer as a Christian over the years that you are one is this: Church, how would you encourage someone to press on in the Christian life? Imagine someone comes up to you at lunch today and says, "Brother, I'm having a hard time right now. I don't know, I'm not able to love the Lord right now. I feel cold. I feel indifferent. Prayer just seems it's a thing that I don't want to touch. The Word is something I really don't want to get into. What do I do?" It's everyone's most favorite scenario to have to think through, right? What do you say in the moment to that? Well, brethren, that's an important question to answer. How would you encourage someone to press on in the Christian life in that kind of way? Now, granted, as you think about that question, there's probably a lot of different answers, and not everyone's going to answer that question exactly the same way, and there's going to be many good and right answers to that. But, brethren, the thing we don't want to do when we think about things like this is what Paul's not doing in this text, is when the moment arrives and it's presented itself to us, we don't want just 25 potential answers, right? We don't want to go, well, I know 25 really good things. Brethren, what will you land on? Right? That's what matters in the moment, is that person's really going through something. They really want to know, how can I be encouraged to press on here? And so, brethren, the important thing for us to ask is, what actually is our answer to something like that? Brethren, what if it's you? What's your answer to your own soul in a moment like that? And I think this text here is helpful for us, brethren. You're going to see Paul's heart here. If we could ever say Paul has a pastoral heart, you got this kind of thing going on right here. This is the very thing that Paul is facing here in this section of Ephesians, right? And let me make this connection here as an introduction. Last week when Manny finished preaching these first set of verses, we ended with that verse right there in 13. So we just read 14 to 21, so why don't you keep your finger right there and just go back one verse. And I think you'll understand why I'm asking that question. What does Paul say right here in verse 13? Well, he says to the Ephesians, "So I ask you not to lose heart over what I am suffering for you, which is your glory." So this begs the question then, right? When we go back one verse, we understand these sections are connected. Forget your header right there on this section. Absolutely forget it this morning, right? It's connected here to verse 13. But it begs the question here for us. Why does Paul tell them not to lose heart over what he is suffering, right? If you're sitting in front of that brother and that brother is struggling with something, you tell him, "Hey, brother, don't lose heart." It's not because the The person who's struggling in front of you it's some abstract struggle. There's a real life tangible thing going on for you. You have to say, brother, don't lose heart in this. Brother, don't lose heart in this kind of thing. So why would Paul have to tell the Ephesians, don't lose heart? Don't lose heart over why I'm suffering. And I want us to think about this, right? Because I think there's a few reasons. So first, think about this. Manny mentioned this last week. Paul's in prison, right? So Ephesians 3:1, you get this play on Paul's imprisonment, right? If you put all the timeline together from Acts and when these letters are written, pretty certain, about 99.9% sure Paul's in prison when he's writing Ephesians. And we get this play on it back in 3:1 when Paul says this, for this reason I, Paul, a prisoner, right? But he doesn't say of Rome here at this point. He's playing on his imprisonment right here. And he plays on it by referring to himself not as the prisoner of Rome, but as of who? It says he's a prisoner of Christ, right? So he is suffering, therefore, due to this imprisonment, though he really sees his imprisonment ultimately as, well, I'm a prisoner of Christ. But brethren, we see that right there. Then first thing, there's a reason why these Ephesians would be kind of looking down. Paul's not just traveling around doing whatever he wants to do. Paul is locked up, right? He is suffering due to this imprisonment. But here's what he says right here that I think would remind the Ephesians in a way that was very personal, right? Because it's not also that Paul's suffering right here imprisoned and there's no connection between his suffering in prison and the Ephesians. Here is how Paul describes right there in Ephesians 3 what his imprisonment in Christ is for, right? He says he is a prisoner of Christ on whose behalf? On behalf, he says you, on behalf of you Gentiles, talking to most of these Ephesians in this church, right? He's just been spent all that time reminding them, hey, you remember you all as Gentiles, right? Well, now he's saying, I'm a prisoner of Christ on behalf of you all Gentiles. Y'all Gentiles in the church, I'm a prisoner of Christ on your behalf. Which, brethren, leads into a second reason why he would tell them not to lose heart over him in his suffering. Paul is suffering imprisonment precisely because he's going around Rome, right? This whole Roman Empire, preaching in the synagogues, but yet at the same time, he's going to the Gentiles, and all these Gentiles are getting saved. I mean, that's why Paul's in prison. Paul's not in prison because Rome doesn't like him. Brethren, at this point in time, Rome is Paul's friend. Rome is constantly getting Paul out of a lot of trouble because Paul can appeal to his citizenship. Paul is in prison exactly for the reason that he preaches the gospel to Gentiles and they come in to know Christ without circumcision, without the law, without Moses. So, brethren, you can imagine when Paul identifies himself that way, he says, Paul, a prisoner of Christ on behalf of you Gentiles. And then he has to tell them, don't lose heart because I'm in prison, because they're thinking it's our fault. Paul is literally in prison because we became Christians. And you could see how they could lose heart to that kind of thing. I mean, brethren, wouldn't you feel that way? Wouldn't you feel that way if Nick or Manny, one day, they're out there in prison and then they're writing to us and they're saying, hey, I kind of got thrown in prison because I was preaching in church last Sunday. I mean, you'd feel that. You'd feel bad for that kind of thing. But here's Paul doing this. He's upsetting his own people according to the flesh because he's allowing these Gentiles in, right? And so Paul's problem arose simply because these Jews don't like the fact that Paul is preaching to Gentiles, and they don't like the fact that these Gentiles are coming in to know the Messiah, and they don't have to carry any extra baggage that the Jews think they need to carry. And so we got to remember this. So Paul gets right there and he says, listen, back in Ephesians 3:13, I'm asking you not to lose heart over what I'm suffering for you, right? Because for Paul, it's not a big deal. But for them, brethren, they're struggling over here. They're struggling because he's suffering on their behalf for the very reason that he wouldn't preach the gospel to them and they believed. So we have to think about that, how these recipients, these large group of Gentile Christians, they would be feeling right here. And so how does that bring us back into that question that I asked you? How would you encourage someone in the Christian faith to continue to press on who's lost heart? And brethren, that's what this whole section right here is for. It's an answer to 13. Verse 14 of Ephesians 3, if you're still looking there. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father. This whole section right here is an answer to the Ephesians' problem right here, that they're losing heart because the man who preached the gospel to them is now imprisoned because he preached the gospel to them and they believed and they came in. I mean, talk about a situation to find yourself in. And so, brethren, when Paul is teaching us then, okay, how does one continue on in the Christian life to press on who's losing heart? This is very real. This is very tangible, right? Real people really losing heart in a real day and time. But here's going to be the encouraging thing in reading this too, brethren. Paul is not going to tell them something that he himself has not learned. The way that he's going to give to them and to us, this is also the way that Paul has learned this kind of thing. And right here in 14, this is how he says he learned it. Through prayer. And this is why he's praying for them. Through prayer. And brethren, he's going to conclude then that through prayer, that God would do a few things here for them. That it would be through prayer that courage would be instilled into this church. That Christ would dwell in them, as we read on a few verses later. And that they would know the love of Christ, which he says in a very paradoxical kind of way, it surpasses knowledge. That they would know something that surpasses knowledge. So this is how Paul answers our question. How would you encourage someone to press on in the faith? Well, Paul's going to give us three things here in these verses of how someone does that, because that is the present need of the verses. Because of verse 13, don't lose heart over what I'm suffering for you, which is your glory. So here's the three things that Paul's going to encourage us in and to encourage the Ephesians is, how does someone press on in the Christian life? So three things. One, he bows before the Father. Two, that Christ would dwell in them. And three, that they would grasp the love of Christ and be filled with the fullness of God. So there's our 3 points. This is how Paul's going to answer this question here for us. So let's look at this first one. Bowing towards the Father. So notice how Paul begins right here in verse 14, right? Paul's solution immediately, right? And you got to think about this. Paul's immediate solution, though he is not near them, he says, is to pray. Now, I like to think, too, that if Paul was there in Ephesus, the solution wouldn't change, right? That Paul is not just showing us, well, I'm distant, therefore, the only thing I really got for you is prayer, like it's the only thing on his utility belt that he can pull out as a tool to use right now. But rather that Paul is, I think, looking at the central aspect of how can he ensure that these Ephesians will not lose heart? And he goes, brethren, he goes straight to prayer. What a fitting thing. And I was reading that this week and just thought, man, we love to sound the horn of prayer in this church. And brethren, listen. Though we may like it or really fancy prayer, it's simply just because the Bible does. The Bible puts such weight into prayer. The Bible puts such importance and vitality into prayer. And it should be no surprise. That's what Paul says. For this reason, because you're losing heart, I pray. I get before the Father. I bow before the Father. And so Paul sees one way in which he can encourage these people, and it's that he can pray. But I want you to notice how he describes it, right? Because he doesn't actually say the word prayer right there. We just assume, when you hear the phrase, I bow my knees, you assume prayer, which is true, right? That's one of those expressions that we use over here now, as we translate this through from the Greek into the English, we use that as an expression. If I say I bow my knees, right, or I fold my hands, you're indicating to somebody that you're praying. And so Paul is using this language right here to let us know about this, but I think he's doing more than just simply, I'm just praying. I think he's doing a couple things right here, and I want us to see this. So first, one would obviously be the fact of prayer, right? This bowing of the knees or getting down on knees in prayer is a a way that people have prayed, a position that people have prayed. So you can think of probably the one I thought of first when I thought of this was Daniel. Right, so Daniel chapter 6, you read this. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. And then what does Daniel do? He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So clearly Paul here, and with a bunch of other texts we don't need to go through, he's thinking of prayer. But brethren, I think Paul is using this phrase for an even greater purpose than just say prayer. Because what could have Paul said right here? He could have said, for this reason I pray before the Father, right? He could have just said that. There's a word for prayer in Greek. He could have just said, for this reason I pray before the Father. But he doesn't, right? He uses this expression, I think, purposefully and very intentionally. And so you need to think about this too. As you read the Old Testament, brethren, what does bowing indicate when you bow or you get down on your knees? Yes. Amen, whoever said it. That was not one of those times where I thought someone was going to say something, but amen, I like that. We like when people talk. So yes, submission, right? It's a sign of allegiance. Like you're getting humbled. Like if someone got down on their knees and bowed down before you, you'd feel really awkward, but it would be because that person is humbling and humiliating themselves in such a way as to they're just getting before you. But brother, to bow down on your knees, especially as we think of prayer, is not just an act of prayer, but it's a visual. To say, this is the one whom I have allegiance and loyalty. That's what getting down on the knees means. And so I think Paul's using this then in a twofold manner. And here's how he's doing this to encourage these Ephesians, right? He's seeking to encourage them by what? 1, praying for them, yes. By praying for them, but 2, brethren, and explaining that to them, right? That he's praying for them by saying, hey, you guys are getting down on yourselves? I get down on my knees before the Father for y'all, right? They're probably like, thank you, Paul, for praying for us. But not only is he doing that, brethren, he's also hinting to them at his allegiance and loyalty to the one to whom he's praying, right? Paul is submitted under this great Father, as he says, for this reason I bow my knees before who? Well, it's the Father. There's a specific person he has allegiance and loyalty to. And so Paul submitted under this great Father, which means then that the saints in Ephesus do not need to lose heart for his sake. And here's why. Paul's like kind of telegraphing an image to them as he's doing this, right? Paul himself is telling them, listen, not only am I praying for you and saying, I bow down on my knees, but brethren, this is a sign to them, to the Ephesians, to calm their calm their fears and their anxieties and to strengthen them up again because they're losing heart, that Paul himself is submitted to the will of the one to whom he prays. Right, brethren? I mean, could you imagine Paul is discontent with his time in jail? He's not getting down on his knees, thanking the Father and asking for prayer for the things for these Ephesians. Brethren, you won't do it. I mean, your body will either react or it will go away from something that it doesn't feel like it should do because your mind and your heart are somewhere, right? Those things are not disconnected. Your heart's in it, your body responds appropriately to it. And so Paul is indicating to them and using that language, he is submitted to the will, to the one to whom he prays. And so go back to that description then of him in 3:1. He says, I'm a prisoner of Jesus Christ. So, and you got to think of the irony when Paul is doing this kind of thing. Paul's in prison, not ultimately because of the Romans or the Jews. Paul's in prison because of God, right? Isn't that a thing that we would affirm here? Paul is ultimately in prison because of the plan and the providence of God. And brethren, I think when he says this, he's recognizing that. He has been bound up in physical chains because he recognizes this, that he is bound to Christ on behalf of the Gentiles. He knows both of those things are connected. He sees the greater reality. He doesn't go, oh man, I just got thrown in prison because I was out there preaching the gospel. He goes, no. I'm a prisoner of Christ on behalf of the Gentiles. So if it means a prisoner of Rome for preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, then so be it. He says, I'm a prisoner of Christ for these Gentiles. He says, I'm bound up in chains for this exact purpose. So brethren, if Paul finds himself here bound and chained physically for submitting to Christ in his will, then I think Paul is telegraphing to them with that language, so be it. This was God's will for me. As a prisoner of Christ, it doesn't matter if this is what comes my way, right? And ultimately, my knee is bowed to the Father, right? My thinking about this is not bound up to my situation in life, free, not free. Bound up in prison, free out there roaming around in Rome. No, brother. And he recognizes, I'm bowed towards the Father in prayer, which means I'm also submitted to Him and what He has for me right now. So, brother, when Paul bends down to pray, he's displaying this for them. He's displaying for this love for them. Yes, he's saying, I love you, I'm praying for you. But Paul is also saying, listen, Ephesians, don't lose heart. I am bowed to the will of the one whom I give my allegiance. And that should be a comfort for them. That it's not the Ephesians' fault that he's there. They ought not to lose heart that Paul is there. He's a prisoner of Christ for the Gentiles. That might be the right place for him right there. So how can one press on, brethren, then? Well, prayer. And also to remembering, brethren, you are bowing your knees before the great Father. This is the one to whom we submit our will and our allegiance and our loyalty to. And Paul is telling them both of those things. I love you, so I'll pray for you. And also look at me. I'm bowed my knees before the Father. I am submitted to whatever He has for me. And this is what Paul says. This is a good and right thing. He says, it is for your glory that he is bound up. And brethren, they themselves have to learn that reality too. So here he then goes on to qualify this as we look there in 14. So we're right back there in 14. He's going to qualify his praying with this phrase here in verse 16. So he says, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven on earth is named. And then here's how he qualifies this section right here. That, meaning talking about the prayer, that according to the riches of his glory. So whatever Paul is going to then pray for the Ephesians, which we don't even know what he's praying for yet, he is going to pray in accordance with something. So that's what he means when he says that phrase, that according to the riches of his glory, he may give you this, 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 and this. When Paul is seeking to bring prayer before God on behalf of these Ephesians, brethren, Paul is doing so intentionally. And what's important to see right here, he's doing it in accordance with something. When Paul thinks about how can I strengthen these people so that they don't lose heart, well, he thinks, yes, I got to pray for them, brethren, but it's not just words coming out of his mouth. Paul knows of something he absolutely needs to pray in accordance with for that prayer to grant something effectual to these Ephesians. And brethren, that would be true for us as well. This phrase is signifying this, that Paul prays, and what he is doing is setting some kind of rule or standard by which he prays in accordance with what he is saying. And Manny showed us this last week. You think of this phrase right here, according to the riches of his glory. Well, Manny brought this out the other week. You could translate that wealth, this vast wealth of God's glory. And so this is the measurement that Paul has in mind as he thinks about praying. It's going to be in accordance with this riches or this wealth of God's glory. And so, brethren, listen. When you think about this then, and we think about prayer and its ability to come in and to restore the Christian and to push them on in the faith and to cause them to not lose heart, we ought to have in mind the standard and the rule and the place that we're drawing from as we are praying, so that we know what to ask for when we're praying. Brethren, when we're in need of encouragement, when your own soul is in need of encouragement, you need to pray in light of and in the measure of what he says right here, the wealth of God's glory. That's what you need to pray in light of, right? And that may not seem like such a hard thing. You're probably like, yeah, but brethren, listen, often when we think about praying for someone, we have a lot of other things in mind as we seek to pray for them. A lot of maybe good intentions, a lot of maybe things on our mind, sentimentality, all these different things. But brethren, ultimately Paul says, I want you to pray in accordance with the way, with the riches or the wealth of God's glory. And so why would Paul have to say something like that? Well, brethren, it's because it's what he said earlier, what Manny preached last week. It's because that glory, that wealth is inexhaustible. It's an inexhaustible glory. Brethren, it's also a richness that goes beyond any other richness. You think of the purity and the richness of gold, brethren, it goes beyond that kind of thing. And brethren, it's also valuable. If you can draw from the wealth or the riches of God's inexhaustible glory, brethren, what other thing could you possibly want to pray for in accordance with? I mean, what else would you want to draw on? And brethren, ultimately, that the riches of God's glory would be a worthy thing to pray in accordance with. And that to pray according to nothing else. That we would see the riches of God's glory in Christ for what He has done, for all the promises, for all the benefits. I mean, you go back to chapter 1, and there's those inexhaustible riches or wealth of God's glory when He says, "Blessed be God who has done this for us, who has blessed us with this, who's blessed us with this, who's blessed us with this, who's blessed us with this." I mean, until Paul is blue in the face. So now he can say, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, that according to those riches, that inexhaustible wealth, that glory, I will pray in accordance and in light with that, because I know that is vital, it is rich, it is inexhaustible, and it is worthy of us to pray." And brethren, ultimately, that is going to be what's effectual in the life of the Christian. And we can't get that confused. I mean, brethren, we can talk all day long about not looking to other sources outside of Christ for all sorts of things, for preaching, for teaching, not being pragmatic in how we're getting people in the church. But brethren, when we turn to prayer, the same standard is going to apply. We don't want to get pragmatic in prayer and pray whatever we want just so we can try to make somebody feel, brethren. Brethren, we need to draw upon the riches and the wealth of the glory of God and the promises of Christ. I mean, that's where we got to go. We want to see somebody press on, brethren. It doesn't matter how sentimental you are to them, right? How many good times have we had with people in this church who are now no longer here? A lot. Brethren, and it wasn't good enough. That friendship, those shared times, those good feelings, those butterflies, those smiles. Yes, brethren, they are blessings from God, right? But it did not keep them from losing heart. What will? The wealth of the glory of God in the promises of Jesus Christ. Brethren, we have to bank upon that kind of thing. Nothing else will do. And Paul knows that. He's in prison. And he goes, in accordance to the riches of His glory. That's what I'm praying. And so here's how he fleshes that prayer out here. So 16, that according to the riches of His glory. And then here's these next couple of clauses where he begins to draw this out. So notice what he says in this first section. So this is verses 16 and part of 17. That according to the riches of His glory, He may grant you to be strengthened with power through His Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. So Paul, all the way up until 20, is going to continue to just ramp this thing up until it crescendo. So here's how he's starting this. He's building on this statement. So Paul wants granted to them in his praying before the Father in light of the riches of God's glory. This is the first thing that he wants to pray for. Strength. So you see that there, right there in 16. According to the riches of His glory, He may grant, here's what he wants God to grant for them, grant you to be strengthened. Now another way, and maybe a better way, you could translate this not because the word is necessarily a bad translation, but the idea behind this strength would be something like courage. Right? You know, sometimes we think of strength and we feel like, my meter's at 40% and I need my power meter to be at like 100, so I'm really strong. Well, it's not that kind of strength, right? This is strength as it relates to courage. And you can think of a way Paul and other writers have used this in the Bible. So in Old Testament, we get a couple examples like this, 1 Samuel 4. This is a negative example, but nonetheless, I think it displays this thing. So this is an example of where the Philistines here they hear that something's coming our way. We need to get rid of this Ark of the Covenant thing. This was a bad move to bring this kind of thing. And so here's what it says here in 1 Samuel chapter 4. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A god has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness." Now here's what they're saying to each other in light of their fear. Take courage. Same word right here. It'd be like strengthen yourselves. But the idea is take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So you get that example right there in the negative. Now here's a positive example. 2 Samuel chapter 10. Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people, for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. So right there it would be strengthened up. But it's better translated, be of good courage, right? It's like you're about to go fight, you got to get some courage in you. You can't lose heart in the day of battle. And then Paul says the same thing to the church in Corinthians right there at the end. He says, be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, and then right here, be strong, right? Let all that you do be done in love. So the same idea right there, be strengthened, be strong, be courageous would be the idea. So when we hear that Paul wants this first thing granted here for them to be strengthened, he wants this granted for them for courage's sake. He wants them to be courageous. Now, brethren, you could understand why. He just said in 13, what? Don't lose heart. And brethren, what happens to people when they lose heart? They ready to fight? People ready to run off into battle and fight the good fight of faith when they lose heart? Brethren, they're not. And he wants this thing granted for them because Paul's also recognizing something that's going to happen later on here in Ephesians. Paul recognizes, listen, Ephesians, this is not the day to lose heart. This is not a time for them to be losing heart. As we're going to see later on in chapters 5 and 6, the Ephesians are being tested. And as we get, especially when we get into chapter 6, you think of that chapter on putting on the full armor of God. It's not just some random thing Paul throws in there. Hey, just throw on the whole armor of God because it sounds really cute. Brethren, they're losing heart, and he's having to encourage them, hey, the evil day is upon you. This time of testing, the schemes of the devil are going on around you. He is shooting out arrows, seeing who he's going to get in battle because you guys have lost heart. And he's telling them, listen, you need to be strengthened up. You need some courage. You need to be fortified once again. Almost like a blatant call to say, act like men. You guys gotta buck up. You guys need to get some courage. Because Paul knows men lose heart. And what happens to them in the day of trial? What happens to them in the evil day? They get tested. Brethren, they don't stand. And Paul in Ephesians 6 is going to say, so that you would be able to what? Stand in the evil day, not fall away. So he prays, Lord, I bow my knees before you. Give them strength. Give them courage. They're in a battle, and it's a fierce one. He says later on, not against flesh and blood, right? But against much greater powers. The Ephesians cannot afford to lose heart right now. So he qualifies this then again. So he says that they need strength in this first part. And then right after he says that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant to you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit. And this is key. Because though we can think of that phrase of someone to, get courage, man, you got to buck up, man, you got to man up, like you got to act like men right now. This is not just some hardy, be a man kind of thing right now and just really like get your vitality going. Paul is letting them know where the strength, the courage has to come from. It has to come with power through his Spirit. This type of strength and courage is something they need, but it's also something that's wrought in power through the Spirit. This is not something you can go buy at the store. It's not something that you can just pick up in a book. This kind of strength is acquired by the Spirit, brethren, and ultimately is exercised through the Spirit. Which means we could say it like this. This is a strength and a courage, brethren, that is supernatural. This is not something you can just go home and, drink a little thing before you go work out, and now you're pumped up to go do it, brethren. That's not how it works. This is something that is more than just mere grit and more than just human effort that can't just simply be explained away. Brethren, this kind of power is spoken of by Paul in a number of other places. And he speaks this way in relationship to two other aspects in the Christian life, conversion and the Christian life. So here's some examples where Paul speaks this way about this power that has an effect upon something, and there's no words of eloquence or anything to explain it. It just happens. It's something God does. So this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 5. Because our gospel came to you not only in word, but also in what? Also in power, and in the Holy Spirit, and with full conviction, right? So how does he know that the message came with power and with the Spirit and with full conviction? Well, as he goes on later to say at the beginning of that letter, it's because of their faith. They believed, and then their faith resounds, and he knows. We know that our gospel came with more than just words. People were radically changed. People were converted. The power of God was on display. 1 Corinthians 2, he says it very similarly. And my speech and my message, this is Paul speaking again, were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith may not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So same idea going on there as you have there in in 1 Thessalonians. And then notice how he talks about this in regards to the Christian life as well. This is Romans chapter 15. May the God of hope fill you with all peace and joy in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in what? That you might abound in hope. So once again, Paul is given almost like this closing remark right here, that they would abound in this hope that gets brought in power and by the Spirit and has a supernatural origin and effect upon the people, where this is not just something that they conjure up. And this one was my favorite because it ties directly into Ephesians right here, but this is in 2 Timothy. He says, for this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of what? But of power and love and self-control. I mean, you think especially about that last one in Timothy. Where is Timothy when Paul writes to him? Where's Timothy located? What church is Timothy in? Yeah, see, you know the answer is going to be there. He's in Ephesus, right? And he's got to tell them that, listen, God did not give us a spirit of fear, right? You can imagine some of them are losing heart because of things that are going on. Paul's in prison. He's about to go off and be executed. He writes to Timothy, I'm about to be poured out over here. I'm almost up. I'm about to finish my course, my race. And he's having to even remind Timothy of all people. God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of self-control. So, brethren, Paul knows this. Paul knows that the power, that this strength, where the strength is given, it must be drawn on by the Spirit. And then he finishes it with this phrase right here. He says, in your inner being. So he says that he may grant to you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit. Where? In your inner being. Now, very interesting that Paul would use a phrase like that. He doesn't really use that phrase a whole lot. But why would Paul have to say, in your inner being? It's like God grants it to you, but where's he going to place it? He's going to place it inside of you, at the core of who you are, as he's going to say later, in your heart. That's where the inner being is. It's the heart. And so Paul is trying to pinpoint where this, one, what they need, and two, where this thing really, it needs to come from the Spirit, and then it needs to germinate from a place. And you know what, brethren? It's not from the outside. He tells them this is something that goes to the core of who you are, right? Paul's not asking for a mere display of like courage outwardly or a display of strength outwardly where, you may be able to feign courage by uttering words like, yeah, we're going to do it. We'll be okay. We got this. We got that. But then you lack the reality of it in your heart. He's saying the strength and power that is needed is to be granted. Brethren, it's got to come from the inner man, the innermost being. And this is where we need it to arise, right? Because Paul knows that in his own life, that when he has prayed for God to strengthen him, to give him courage, to help him to press on, Paul was not often given some extraordinary outward physical displays of strength, but rather he was given inward ones. I mean, think about how Paul speaks of himself as it regards to his own safety and his own physicality during his ministry. So this is 2 Corinthians 11. Notice how Paul says all these things about his physical body, the things that happened to him because of his ministry. He says, to my shame, I must say, we were far too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, and toil and hardship, and through many a sleepless night, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? Am I not weak? Who is made to fall? Am I not indignant? And so, brethren, you can imagine why Paul would be concerned of you want to know, how do I know, right? Because that's such an interesting thing to think of, okay, that we would have this strength through the power of the Spirit granted to us in our innermost being. Well, brethren, the way that you know that prayer has been answered is because of where it begins to originate. Brethren, this strength, this renewal, this desire to not lose heart and to press on and to do even as Paul did, to maybe not receive any help physically, but in fact have to continue to go through beatings and all sorts of trials and difficulties physically, to where your body is beat, your life is beat, your mind is beat, you're emotionally beat. But brethren, you know in your inner being, by the power of the Spirit, I got courage to press on. I mean, that's the only way I see in this text to know how that kind of thing is granted in prayer. It's that the person in their innermost being goes, I'm going to press on. I'm not going to allow these things to cause me to lose heart. I'm going to press on. And brethren, it's like that thing of, how do you know you're a Christian? How do you know the Bible is true? How do you know God exists? Brethren, it's because God has testified by His Spirit to me. He's made known that to me. I mean, how else can you explain it? And brethren, the same thing. Paul experienced all this hardship more than anyone. The Ephesians are going through hardship, and Paul's main desire is not that everything gets better around them, not that they utter words of bravado and all these things, that they're all tough and that they all just need to man up. He tells them, Lord, grant them courage in the power through the Spirit in their inner being, so that they could know that if they go through everything that Paul does and all the sufferings that they themselves are about to go through, they can know, oh, brethren, it didn't originate with me. It didn't originate from somebody outside of me. Brethren, it originated from God. In my inner being is where He put it, to where I could go through all the other things and be physically downtrodden and beaten and literally hanging on for an inch of life. And yet in my heart of hearts, no, I'm pressing on. God has given me courage and I am moving on. And brethren, to have that kind of assurance as a child of God, to go, He has granted me courage in the day of adversity because I'm standing. Even if I die, I'm still standing, but I'm going to stand. I mean, brother, what a thing for Paul to pray for, and what a thing we often overlook in that text. Which leads him to the result, brethren, that Christ would dwell in their hearts through faith. This is the great end of prayer for Paul. He knows it. To him, praying in accordance with the measure of the wealth of God's glory ought to always result in that Christ would dwell in their hearts through faith. And we learned this. Maybe we didn't realize the connection was there, but we've learned this last couple of weeks going through Ephesians, right? The beginning of Ephesians chapter 3, 1 through 13, right? You get this expression of Jew and Gentile, them being united together, Gentiles now being these fellow heirs and partakers of the promise. And brethren, the result of this was what? It's this formation of this one new man, this one new temple, whereby God himself does what? He dwells there. That God now dwells in his church by his Spirit. And so Paul then is in effect praying for this kind of thing. And he's not praying for it because they don't have it, right? He's already stated indicatively, right? He's stating fact. God has done this for you and declared something over you guys. He's made you into one. He has actually done the work. You guys stand upon something now. And yet Paul could also recognize that as he prayed. He's saying, Lord, as I pray, grant to them strength that they would, in the power of the Spirit in their inner being, so that Christ would continually, in his fullness, to dwell among them through faith. Because, brethren, chapter 2 into 3 is explaining us what the whole course of human history was leading up to, and now what God has done in the present reality that we live in. And so Paul wants to continue to pray this for them, because that is the great end for anybody who is in Christ. It is to dwell with God. And so Paul's prayer then, in effect, is that the Ephesians would be strengthened and empowered from the heart so that they could continue, brethren. This is such the important key, that they would continue to experience Christ dwelling among them as God's new dwelling place. The place where God's inexhaustible, unsearchable, inexpressible wealth of glory can be found and enjoyed, brethren. That's where God dwells. And he's praying for these Ephesians who are losing heart. Lord, strengthen and give them courage that they'd be able to stand and that they would know Christ dwelling among them, that he would dwell in their hearts, that they would know it in their being themselves, that God is with me. So there is his first clause of this prayer. So this next one, he continues to build. So we're going to look at 17 through 20. So the second half right now, he's still continuing to build on this. This is not something separate. He is just simply like stacking up blocks right here till we hit the peak of this thing at the end. So here, Paul would want all of this granted so that, as we just read, Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. So Paul's got this really weird, interesting phrase kind of stuck between these two right here, because, you read it and most people comment on this and say it's a prayer, and undoubtedly it is a prayer. But you look right there at 17, and all he said, and all of a sudden he starts to pray for, he starts addressing them in the middle of this prayer. I mean, it's usually a weird thing to do. Most of you in the middle of Wednesday night don't go, Lord, please help this brother, and then look at me and go, that you, brother, would just be strengthened. And the Lord, you don't do that kind of thing. It's but Paul just can't help himself right here, right? He's just breaking out wherever he wants to, without ever he's feeling right here. And so he gives us this little reminder right here that links just back with what he just said. First, as he says, that you being rooted and grounded in love. Well, brethren, he's trying to remind them of the thing that we just finished with. This is something that they're already grounded in. He's not asking for Christ to come and to dwell with them, because Christ didn't dwell with them, but rather he's saying, I want it more and more and more for you to continue And so he's reminded them, this is something that you're already grounded and rooted in, right? They're like a plant that's already been rooted into the ground, or they're like a building that's already, the foundation's already been laid. And he's trying to remind them of that kind of thing. And second, and I think more importantly, that this reality is something that actually allows for Paul to ask for this last thing, right? Paul's not going to get before the Father and ask something to be granted to these people to whom it can't come to, right? And so it's like he's front-loading it, like, you guys are grounded and firmly rooted in love, which I would take is the love of Christ, that inexhaustible weight of glory that we've already talked about, that kind of thing. You guys are rooted and grounded in this kind of thing. It actually gives Paul a foundation to even make this kind of request. And that's this. The thing that's really interesting in this section. So that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may what? May have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. I mean, what a statement. I spent so much time on these verses, and I could not put it into words. How do you explain that? I mean, you even go look at other commentators, and they just say, here's Paul putting these things together to leave us baffled. It's pretty much what they're saying. So you get this crescendoing effect right here. So notice what he says that he wants them to do. Here in verse 18. That they would have strength to comprehend with all the saints. Now, this right here was a little bit different than the strength we talked about back in verses 16 and 17. This strength is not one of courage. This one would be better, I think, actually translated as to grasp or to have some kind of efficiency in, right? Almost like he was saying that you would be able to or efficient to grasp or comprehend with the saints what I'm about to tell you. This is the kind of thing that they would have. But notice that this one is building on top of our previous one. This is something that as they dwell with Christ continually, and you think about it, not just individually, they're dwelling together with Christ in unity in this new temple, this new man, this church, that something would come about because of this. And it would be that they would be efficient or able to, or have the strength to, grasp or comprehend some kind of concept. And it would ultimately be 19. To know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. But it's really funny what he does right there. Because he kind of just stops a thought, and it's really a shame. I really want to know what he was going to say. Because if you stop and slow down and read the sentence, you realize he doesn't actually name the thing. We can only imply what he was going to say based upon the next sentence. So in 18, we get what he wants us to try to comprehend, but then he doesn't finish the sentence. So let's read it slowly, and maybe you'll catch it when I read it. So he says that you may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and the height and depth. And you're thinking he's going to tell you of what, right? And he doesn't. He just stops his sentence. He just finishes it. You're like, Paul, the breadth and length and height and depth of what? He just stops. And then if you look at 19, and to know the love of Christ. Like, why would you do that? Why would you build us up like that and give us something where it's like, man, it's like this guy's measuring this huge thing, and then he doesn't give you the name of what it is. He's just like, man, this thing, breadth, width, height, length, depth, it's going to be awesome. And also, this thing over here. And so it's just this interesting thing. It's almost like Paul himself is coming in and getting this visual and this measurement of this thing that he wants these saints to grasp together, and he can't even finish his sentence. He just can't do it. Like he can't even put a word on it to say, this thing that I've measured out, this thing that I want God to grant to you, that you would have efficiency to grasp and to comprehend. He can't even finish the sentence. It's like, he's like, I've measured it, but it's, what is this thing? So he can just conclude right there in 19. To know the love of Christ, right? That surpasses knowledge. Even his own knowledge, even his own ability to finish his own sentence. I mean, we're talking about Paul. Paul just, his sentence ends. He doesn't know how to finish it. So he just has to conclude. Know the love of Christ. That surpasses that whole kind of thing. Even words, brethren. Even words. I mean, what? Church, as I was thinking about that, and I thought about ways in which we encourage one another, or when somebody is losing heart. Why it is such a necessity and a reality for us to fall back on prayer and to ask God for help. Because, brethren, sometimes not even words can do something. I mean, they just can't. Sometimes what somebody needs, especially Christians, goes beyond what you can tell them. It goes beyond something that you can express to them. It goes beyond the sentimentality that they're your brother and your friend and close to you like family. Brethren, this is why Paul's got to get before the Father and ask Him to grant it. Paul can't do it. Paul can't finish his sentence. And he knows they're losing heart. And so he says, this is what I want you to know, but I don't even have words for it. But he knows who to go to for it, brethren. And you need to know where to go to. Brethren, when someone is that deep down and losing heart, do you find yourself there like Paul? For this reason, I bow before my knees before the Father. That's what I need. I got to bank on this inexhaustible, inexpressible riches of glory, or this person or these people have nothing. They will have nothing. There will be no end. There will be no resolution. I got to get before the Father. And it's like Paul can kind of see it. He's got a vision of it. And brethren, oftentimes you do too. It's like, what does somebody need in that moment? Well, we could all answer that. They need Jesus. But what does that mean? They need Jesus. We know that, right? It's like we know the right answer, but we can't put the words to it to get them to see it, to get them to embrace it. And because, brethren, it's like I said earlier, because this thing is supernatural, you need God to do this thing. You need Him to do it. And yet, brethren, He's also here asking. He's also asking God to grant them something that they can grasp and have some kind of hold on. I mean, how paradoxical is this? Paul can't finish the sentence, but he's going to pray God grants to them the ability or efficiency to, you could even translate it in a really strong way, to seize, to grasp, to really lay hands upon what this thing is, this love of Christ that surpasses knowledge and words. He still prays, Lord, grant them that they could do that, even though he can't finish his sentence. And brethren, here's why he can pray that. And it's what he's already said earlier, back in 16 and 17. Because this is something that God has to do and then plant within the inner being of a Christian. Now, you may get weird about that and think that's super experiential. We're just relying upon a feeling in doing that. And listen, brethren, I get that. I know that there are feelings that can betray us. I know that people are told to trust in their hearts and do all sorts of silly things and nonsense. But let's not skip over this right here. Brethren, this is something that has to well up from inside. It has to be something that God gives, because it will be something that when the Christian experiences it and that God promises to us, that Paul prays for us, brethren, is something that's only going to be known by experience. It's not going to be something that you can quantify and put the data down on paper and turn in a report and say, we experienced the surpassing worth of Jesus Christ. Look at all my bullet points. Brethren, the Christian life does it not go beyond that. Have you not had those times in your life experiencing the love of God that if you were to tell a random person, they'd be like, that dude thinks he talks to God. Or that girl thinks like she goes off in her prayer closet and is like speaking to somebody. I mean, brethren, you know that to be true as a Christian, that there is such a deep reality to the Christian life that goes beyond the mere intellect, that goes beyond mere knowledge and mere words. And so Paul can say, I want you to know this thing that surpasses your knowing. I want you to know this kind of thing that surpasses even my own words. You can't finish this sentence. I want you to know this, and I'm going to pray that God grants it to you. And he's praying that it can happen, right? He's praying that it can happen because these people can really not stand in the evil day. These people really can lose heart and end up walking the way. So Paul's not going to pray something for these people that can't actually happen. Paul knows, Lord, you can do the impossible, which is what his benediction is, right? You want to ever pray that benediction in a new light? Now you go, Lord, you can really grant us the strength to be able to seize or to grasp and to know the breadth, the length, the height, and the depth of whatever it is, the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. You can do that because you're able to do far more abundantly than we could even ask. God can do it, brethren. He can do it, even when you can't put words to it, even when it seems impossible. But I want us to notice one last thing here as we close, because this is important. And this is also a little bit providential with what Nick shared at the beginning. Brethren, note it well, highlight it in your dang Bible today, where this kind of thing is going to be answered in. That you may have strength to comprehend with who? With all the saints. Brethren, God answers this prayer for you among God's people. Don't ever forsake them. That's where it's going to be had. When you're losing heart, like our brother and sister who we prayed for, you don't pull yourself away from the body you were joined to, the temple you've been built and stacked into. Because this is where Paul's praying for it to happen, brethren. You can't go up to Mount Charleston and just get it yourself. Can't go to the store across the street and just go buy it. That's not how this works. You want to be able to comprehend something that surpasses even words, brethren, it's with all the saints. It's with God's people. And notice what the result of all of this is going to be there at the end of 19. That you may be filled. And there, it's you all. That you all may be filled with all the fullness of God. Brethren, that is the same language that you get right there at the end of chapter 2, where he tells them that in whom, he's speaking of the church, the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into what? A dwelling place for God by his Spirit. Brethren, Paul is making this grand conclusion for us, that the result of this massive prayer for these Ephesians is that God, the fullness of God, would fill up this church. The fullness of God's glory, his worthiness, his love, his zealousness, everything that comes with God for his people would fill up the church in light of this prayer. It's like saying, Lord, that they would know this thing and that they would know everything and they'd have the fullness of you. It'd be like asking, Lord, pour yourself out to the brim. Make it just overflow within our body of your glory, of your goodness. And then we get that benediction that is so famous. But brethren, as we read this benediction now and as we close, you think about that really short prayer. You think about what Paul is asking for as he bows his knees before the Father. And now you go back to that question right there at the beginning. If someone was losing heart, how would you encourage them to go on? Well, brethren, Paul is our example here because he was the example for the Ephesians. And so notice how he ends here in this benediction. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.